grief begins 41 years ago. I was 18. I had just gone off to my freshman year in college. It's sort of my first time away from home. And 3 weeks into it, when just about the time I was starting to get the rhythm and not having a big old lump of homesickness in my throat every morning,
Mm.
I came back from a morning class. And back then we had one big black phone between the dorm rooms. And the girls next door said, "Yeah, the phone, someone's been calling for you." And I didn't have to wait long for the phone to ring again. And it was a guy named Stuart Sherman, who was the father of a good friend of my 13-year-old brother David's, my only sibling. And Mr. Stewart said, "Jennifer, I want you to sit down."
Mm.
Really never good news when they tell you to sit down. And he told me that my brother had been in an accident, that he was still alive, and he had made arrangements for me to come home. So I packed a bag and I flew home, and David was in a coma, and he had sustained some pretty bad injuries. And he for 3 weeks he was in the coma, and then there was, an MRI revealed no brain activity. And so my parents had to make the difficult decision to extubate him. And he died on October 20th, 1983.
Wow.
Yeah.
How old was he?
He was 13.
Holy
I
shit.
was, yeah, holy shit, indeed. I was 18. Hmm. And I can tell you, we don't do grief great now. We really didn't do it
Mm.
well in 1983.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can also tell you, as a survivor sibling, specifically a sole survivor sibling, I think a lot of grief stories are unique. There are as many different grief stories as there are grievers. M- But I think it's safe to say, in general, survivor siblings suffer multiple losses because parents just aren't able to be parents to the remaining kid or kids when they have lost one of them. They're just crushed under the grief of having outlived one of their children. And so, I think it was just a, particularly profound loss for me. I mean, it was for them too, of course, but, you know, I kind of lost all three of them that
Mm.
day. And, that, that just shaped me, at 18,
Yeah.
and now I'm 59. And I can just tell you that it shaped me. It shaped just about everything about the last 41 years. Yeah. Not quite 20 years after David's death, my mother was diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer. And by the time it was diagnosed, it was already in her spine and lots of other places. And so she lived for 5 weeks following the diagnosis. I was her caregiver during those 5 weeks, and she died. And I c- I can honestly say that I think the news of her diagnosis, on some level, she welcomed. I don't think she wanted to live to the 20th anniversary of my brother's death. I
Mm.
think it was very comforting for her to be able to make an honorable exit. We didn't talk about this, but I suspect she really struggled a lot with going on after his death. And so, in a weird way, it was a blessing that she died of, cancer about about 6 months before what would have been the 20th anniversary of his death. And I can also say that perhaps I didn't experience some of the same parental grief that a lot of folks do when their parents died, because I sort of felt I had lost them, her, both of them, a long time prior,
Mhm.
and had a lot of responsibility as the sole survivor sibling. So I miss her. I still miss her. She was a wonderful mother, but there was a sense of, her being unburdened of her life, outliving her son. And so that wasn't as I've gotten into this space of, you know, death and so forth since the publication of my journal, I've learned that lots of people, when they lose parents, I mean, a parental loss is one of the biggest losses that, people describe. And I get it, except that I just didn't experience it that way because of David's death.
Mm.
So anyway, and then I met and fell in love. I don't know how much of the sort of backstory, but later in life, I met the most amazing man. He was a physician. He had been a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, and unable to operate because of a neck injury that caused, really bad pain. In microsurgery, you have to sort of do this Dracula position, wear the loops to be able to visualize the structures. And he couldn't do that anymore because of an injury in his neck. And so he had retrained in hospice and palliative medicine. I didn't meet him until
Oh,
after he was already doing hospice and palliative medicine.
okay.
It was super. There were many things about him that were wonderful, but the hospice and palliative medicine was one of them for me because of my brother being in the coma for 3 weeks and knowing what our family had gone through, and because of my mother, dying of cancer. So I knew how important the work he was doing was.
Mhm.
Besides, he was adorable and smart and funny and all the good stuff that makes you fall in love with a person. And I fell in love with him, and we got married, and we had this amazing, amazing life. And then he found a couple of lumps on the left side of his neck.
Mm.
And it turned out they were metastatic sites of a renal clear cell carcinoma, and, already stage 4, already also in his spine. And he lived for 22 months following the diagnosis, and I took care of him. We did very thorough preparation for his death and my survivorship. And, I bring that up because I think it's so important. Grief is excruciating when it's combined with an unprepared for death of an adult. It gets really muddled with administrative, crap that you have to do after someone dies.
Yeah.
Whereas if we would all do a little bit better job of preparing and having these conversations and making plans, right? Because it's not an if,
Yes.
it's a when. That was certainly a great gift that Bob and I left for me. And it doesn't make it easy. It makes it easier
Yeah.
after someone dies when things were really well prepared for. So that was another, that I'm not sure it's wise to compare, but I would have to say that at this point, that's been really the toughest loss. And then 2 years ago, my dad died. So he died he had congestive heart failure and lots of lung disease, and he was 85, and it was peaceful, and yeah, and so he died 2 years ago. which, leaves me alone. I did not have kids, and, I don't have any other siblings, and so I'm on my own, with the exception, of course, of some extended family and a wonderful group of friends. So that's that.
Yeah,
Those are my big ones. There's been a couple of other significant losses, friends, and so forth, but those are the big ones, the ones that make up my family.
appreciate you sharing all of that. It is it's a lot. It's I definitely want to go back to the beginning, but the question I had in my mind first too is I'm like trying to lay out these timelines. So you met Bob after your mother had passed?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay.
Many
Okay.
years after, not
Gotcha.
after she passed, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So it was
Probably about 7 years after she passed.
and what was your
Mhm.
brother's name again?
David.
David, that's right. Okay, so it was David and then Bob. So 18 years old, we're really not supposed to experience death yet, or at least societally, that's what we say. Uh, and now you have somebody as close as your brother. And you said it affected the past 41 years of your life. So I want to start there of what what did you feel was happening at the time, because you're now ready to go out into the world and to learn how to be an adult, but like you said, you lost your whole family, your brother and your mom and your dad. What did that look like? What was that effect in your life as you're like preparing to go be an adult now? Mm. Mm. Same. Wow. Oh, okay. Mm.
No.
Yeah. Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Mm. Mhm. Yeah. That's a lot. Yeah, I can imagine. It's interesting that the reaction you had to the grief was to go hard into just focusing on your studies, right? Or like, do you feel like you were doing that almost as a distraction from okay. So I'm curious. Yeah. Well, so yeah.
That's pretty impressive to be able to focus that much.
I was just gonna say because it's so hard for me to I was the opposite. I could not put myself into work or studying or whatever the case may be. For me, I was like, I just I just had to wallow in it. I could not like it took everything in me to be like, okay, I gotta focus. I gotta focus. I gotta focus. But I guess I want to know like that was the reaction to David dying. And then you mentioned that it was a different sort of grief and experience when your mother had passed because in some ways you already had grieved her, right? By losing like maybe that presence in your life to the degree that it was before David passed. So I want to do a comparison of David passing and Bob passing and was your reaction the same or has things changed and evolved for you as you have started to learn and explore your grief, which I want to get into? So the reaction was different, very different for him when he passed.
Yeah, the reaction with Bob was much different. Of course, I was I don't know, 35 years older than I had been when David died, and had lost some other extended family, grandparents and more in order deaths, instead of David was an out of order, right? He was young, whereas the grandparents are supposed to die before you, kind of thing. And so, and then of course, another big difference was that Bob was sick for 22 months. And so like I said, we really thoroughly prepared. And Bob used to tell families that he cared for in his palliative care and hospice practice, when death was approaching,
Mhm.
he would tell the family, "You're into precious time." And he would say it just like that. I sort of thought at first that that was because he was from Texas, and you know how like Southerners say insurance and umbrella, and I thought he was just like kind of putting the emphasis on the first word, but that was purposeful. Precious time is a type of time. It is the time that comes at the end of life. And I think especially when people have diagnoses like cancer, even some chronic diagnoses, especially in our healthcare system, we get so wrapped up in the health care, the notion of a cure or defeating, if you will, which I hate those sorts of war terminologies and sports terminologies as they relate to disease, but people use them a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, we get so wrapped up, and especially you think about caring for someone who's ill, who's dying, that caregiving, the average duration of that family caregiving is 4.5 years. So for 4.5 years, right, you are trying to help that person live as fully as they possibly can. So you're paying attention to things like blood sugars and lab results and scans and right and good night's sleep and all
Mhm.
this sort of stuff. And what the reason that Bob would use this term precious time with families is because he wanted them to understand no, 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 none of that stuff matters at this point. This is coming to an end.
Yeah.
And this is your time. Precious time is when you say your I love yous and your I'm sorries. And you don't say what you might later regret saying,
Mm.
and you say your goodbyes and you say your thank yous. And it was an incredibly powerful term that helped a lot of families understand that they had shifted into this new phase of their person and saying goodbye to their person. So I knew about this. I mean, we used to get, I say we, that's not true. It was Bob, used to get thank you notes from families of their loved ones who had died saying, "Thank you for telling us," because so many other people, so many other professionals in healthcare won't ever come out and say, "No, no, no, this is happening. Your person is dying."
Yeah.
And that's super important so you can have that precious time and you can make the most of it and just be with them. Anyway, because this was a term that Bob coined, I applied it to us right away. You know, at 22 months out, of course, I didn't know it was 22 months out, but at diagnosis, I believed we were into precious time. We knew it was a terminal diagnosis. We knew it was coming. And so I treated it that way. And that really helped a lot. It helped us just get closer and closer and closer. And
Wow.
we had an intimacy in terms of just being as close as we possibly could, of sharing what was important to him, what was not important to him. I was totally committed to giving him, the life, the end of life, and everything after the end of life that he wanted. And we discussed things just super thoroughly. We prepared on a level that, you know, most folks don't even consider. I tell this story about how about 6 years after Bob died, I was doing some. No, sorry. Let me back up. So we lived in this great big house. Like I said, we were living the dream, right? And when he got sick, he knew I wasn't going to do well in that big house by myself. And he was right. And so we sold that house and we moved in to the condo where I live now. And it's lovely and it's got a doorman and it's, safe and it's all these things that we, especially he kind of mapped out for me, right? Knowing that
Mhm.
I would be alone. And so we moved into this condo and we were able to be here for 10 months before he died together. And so about 6 years after he died, I was doing some, spring cleaning like stuff that you do. And I just gone through drawers and stuff. And all of a sudden I realized there's a flashlight in the top drawer of every structure in this place. And I didn't put
Oh my
them
gosh.
there. Yeah. He put them there
Oh,
for
No
me.
way.
Yeah,
oh my
so
god,
it
I
was
love
just
that.
I know, right? It was just
Mhm.
so beautiful and such that uh and what one of the reasons I think you all found me is because I kept an art journal while I was taking care of Bob. And a couple years after he died, I've been in healthcare for 36 years. I was working in a big clinic. And this neurologist told me that he was diagnosing 3 different patients with ALS. So I brought my art journal into him and he took it home and he came back the next day and said, "You're not getting your journal back. I will be loaning it to these patients and their spouses because it's really going to help them. And you need to figure out how to get that thing published because it'll help a lot of people in that same situation," which I did. And that's basically how I got into this space. The journal was published as the Hospice Doctor's Widow, and it won awards, and it perhaps most important to me is it has helped a lot of people
Mm.
understand that story, especially of losing someone from disease, that story begins much earlier than people realize. And so yeah, so that's how I had documented just a lot of our, stuff, my feelings, a lot of his wisdom, just a lot of stuff that turned out to be super helpful in helping people see how thoroughly we had prepared. Now, I will tell you that the instant he took his last breath, I wanted him back.
Yeah.
Like, as hard as it was, and it's hard, right?
Yep.
When you've got a loved one who has any type of serious disease, there are moments, even in precious time, there are moments that don't feel so precious,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff and it feels like you can't go on at times, but you do. And then the instant he died, I just wanted him back. I almost like all the hard stuff just disappeared
Right.
and yeah, and I just and so but what was nice and one of the things I documented in that art journal was that by doing all the preparation and by me knowing exactly what he wanted in terms of the disposition of his remains and staying in touch with certain people or not staying in touch with people or he had there were some items he had me give to people while he was still alive, and there were some items he asked me to wait until after he died to give them to people. He wrote a number of letters to friends and colleagues,
Oh, wow.
which was really lovely.
Did you make the journal that got published when you loaned it out to the neurologist? Was that something that you were creating as you were going through this with Bob?
Yeah, I was making these. I've been a self-taught collage artist for a long time. Right about the time Bob got sick, I decided to teach myself digital collage, which
Oh,
was
very cool.
yeah, which was intense It was actually in a lot of ways, it was the perfect combination of head and heart, right? Like, I
Mm.
knew what I wanted to create, and yet I mean, you saw me at the beginning of this thing with the technology, right? Like, I couldn't make it do, it took me a lot of head work to figure out how to make it do what I wanted it to do, to express what was in my heart kind of thing. And that just turned out to be a great, occupation of my head and heart. But yeah, I totally did it as we went. There were days, there was a day that we went to the notary public and put the cars and the property in my name. And she said, "Yeah, why are y'all doing this?" And I said, Bob, he was sitting right next to me. And I said, "Bob's dying." And she got really squirmy, weird. And I
Mm.
said, "We're at peace with it," which was something I had heard Bob say to other people and was, for the most part true. I can't tell you I was at peace with it every moment of every day, but
Right.
for the most part, we were at peace with it. And that seemed to relax her enough to get through the task at hand. And so, yeah, so that's a page in the journal. And actually, I don't have it, but I can certainly send it to you. There's a really cool, sorry, I'm looking around to see if I have it anywhere. But I created a symbol, the at sign kind of connected with the peace sign. And that's the art on that page, at peace. So
Did you put any references to the precious time?
yeah, so Precious Time is at the very beginning of the book.
Amazing.
Yeah, yeah. And Precious Time, it's funny, Precious Time has become a almost larger than the book itself because it is such a great, Bob obviously was a physician and I have been in healthcare. So I have now used my experience to educate other, physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals. And Precious Time has been one of the big ones. Like I have on my website, I have a free download that's all about using that term and why we use that term. And it's meant for healthcare professionals. Like, here's how you say this and here's why you use this terminology because it helps people understand that the death is coming. The only thing worse than losing someone you love to an illness
Yeah.
is having lost them and saying, "I thought we had more time."
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's a terror. Bob and I both felt like I'd rather give you the hard news that it's coming to an end and have you maybe be pissed at me for a little bit, but hear me and do what you need to do with your person than to have it slip away. And it happens all the time, that people whose loved one has a, terminal illness and they die and their loved one is just like, I thought we had more time. I didn't say this. I didn't crawl in the bed with her or him or what, they have lots of regrets. And I think Bob and I were both really committed. I mean, Bob first, of course, in his work, and then me once the book came out and the page devoted to Precious Time got, had such resonated with so many people that, and especially healthcare people, that became a big deal.
It is one of the biggest things that haunts me is we knew that my wife was dying. I mean, she had terminal cancer, and we lived as intentionally as we could for the years that we had. But it still felt like it went from 0 to 100 so fast. Like she went from, I mean, she was only NED once the first year, and otherwise it was just a constant. She was constantly under new treatment to try to keep the cancer slowing down. But it went from like, oh, it's just in the bone to it's everywhere, and we're gonna try to treat it. And then it went to, well, we're treating it, to Ashley's dad coming over and being like, "We need to call the doctor. She doesn't look good." And then she was in hospice, and 5 days later, she was gone. And as much time as we thought we had, those final few weeks, I was so concerned, especially that first night in hospice. She woke me up in the middle of the night and barely able to talk, was like, "Get everybody here. It's time." I was like, What the fuck do you mean it's time?" And she's like,
Mm.
"Just get everybody here." And so I was so focused on making sure that the family was there and that the family could say goodbye, that I never ever feel like I got to say my goodbye, because by the time things had calmed down, she was so doped up. Like, she was under so much heavy medication, morphine and fentanyl and every possible thing to make her comfortable. And I hate it. It haunts me. It hurts. It was awful to realize, shit, I never actually got to have that goodbye conversation with her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like you
Exactly.
said, I think it happens so much, and I am grateful that I had so much, we had some years to experience life together knowing she was going to die. When, to be fully honest, when people tell me like, "Well, you're lucky because it didn't happen right away and you got to say goodbye." I'm like, "But I didn't. I didn't
Yeah.
get to say goodbye."
Right.
And that hurts.
Yeah.
You didn't get to say
Yeah.
goodbye in, like, the way you wanted to.
Yeah, we didn't
Right.
get to have those final, "This is what I think." I mean, the night before she went into hospice, she was acting weird and saying things to me, and I was, it was, but we didn't get to have that conversation.
End of life is the one major healthcare event that every single patient faces, right? And yet there is zero taught about it in medical school and residency.
Wow.
Yeah.
Zero. Nothing, nothing is taught. And so you end up with, especially with a young person like your wife, you, eh, 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 you know, this is healthcare's problem, and this is culture, our culture in this country's problem. But it's, oh, we've got this new drug. Oh, we've got this new drug, and just kind of throwing therapies at something and hoping something sticks. When in reality, at some point, we need to be having conversations about what do you really want with the time that's left.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
really want to do with the time that's left? And unless you get a good palliative care team involved and are willing to have those conversations, it really gets lost. And it is ultimately the most important thing, right?
Yeah.
The most important thing is that precious time, because not only, it's a thing that every patient faces their own death, but more than likely, you will outlive someone you love at some point in your life. Every single person will. If we're lucky enough to love, then we're probably going to outlive someone we love. And so it's not just, I mean, to me, it's one of the core elements of well-being. Like, there's just this, like, so many people calling themselves wellness coaches in this world, and yet none of them is talking about having real conversations about wellness up until and beyond the last breath, your own or your loved one. I mean, to me, I don't
Yeah.
know how you have wellness without doing that. But
Mm,
we think, and I will tell you that the number one regret of loved ones, someone who has a loved one who has died in hospice care, the number one regret that those surviving loved ones have is that they didn't admit their loved one to hospice sooner. Because hospice is the time where we just focus on comfort, and
yeah.
we focus on bringing the people in, or, you
Yeah.
spending time alone with your wife and just being. And so, yeah, it's a big regret, and yet it just keeps getting, you know, I could just tell you horror stories about about how hospice is introduced, when in fact it is some of the most important care in our lives.
We had, and I've talked about it on the podcast before, so I don't need to go into detail, but we had our first night. It was our first or second night because we did at home hospice. And, the nurse comes, they get you all set up, give you instructions, and they go. Late into the night, it had seemed that my wife was getting agitated.
Hmm.
And, I think she was probably the, I don't know, eighth person I've watched die. So I wasn't new to this. The people around me had watched folks die, so we weren't new to this. So clearly, like, she was agitated. The whole point is for her to be comfortable. I called, "Hey, is it okay if we do more morphine? I'm not sure what to do. I don't want to hurt her, but it seems like she's not comfortable." I got no instructions on what to do. What I was told verbatim, just call us when she expires.
Oh yeah, that's not how it's supposed to go.
And that was it. And
Yeah,
then my dad called back 30 minutes later and he got the same answer. It was horrific. It was
yeah, that's not how it's supposed to
absolutely
go.
horrific. And I just don't understand how we get hospice so wrong.
Well, we don't always get it wrong. That was wrong. There's no question that that was wrong. Yes, there's no question. That was absolutely horrible. That's not how it's supposed to go. Mm. But yes, the hospice does go wrong
Yeah.
sometimes,
Right.
and then of course I think healthcare in general gets hospice wrong. I
Yeah.
think I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I think there should be a American Board of Medical Specialties exam on every single specialty board examination that asks what is the difference between hospice and palliative care, because I can tell you that 99 out of 100 experienced physicians cannot tell you the difference between hospice and palliative care. And
No
there
way.
is. There's a big difference between the two, and they don't know it. They treat them as synonymous, that they both mean someone's dying, like actively dying. Yeah.
Yeah. That is so scary. And I yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that all of hospice was wrong. What I meant is like how is just this level of care and the requirement for sensitivity feels like it should be very trained in. And why go into it if you don't kind of have a heart for wanting to have that sensitivity. But I wanted no not to steer away from this, but you mentioned something that I really want to get into. So you talked about the language that we use around folks who get terminal diseases or just really anything health related with this sports analogies or these war analogies, right? And I find myself her battle of cancer, the war, that like all this stuff, this harsh language. And I was at a conference one time and so I was talking with this gentleman, and he was a cancer survivor, and he called me out on it. He was like, "Well, I don't really like the term battle or that your wife lost." And it
Interesting.
really stuck with me, and I have yet to figure out the best way to communicate what that experience is like for an individual or for me as caring for her to go through. And every time I go to talk about it, I try to become very aware of that language. So I would love to hear kind of from you more about like what's been your experience, like what is a good way that we can describe the reality of what it's like to go through that in a way that conveys it, but
Right.
also is respectful to what it is. And like, yeah, like they didn't lose. They just, it was their time and this happened to be the outcome.
Can I just go get my book? I have a page
Yes,
I can read to you
absolutely.
Yeah.
that will
Oh, that
solve
would be
this.
amazing.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just so you see, this is the page. And so at the top, in big letters, it has the word beat, warrior, battle, fight,
Mhm.
conquer. And then here's the journal entry. I am so weary of the war language used in describing disease. His sister texts, "We'll conquer this." Obituaries report blank lost his battle with cancer. This is so much more than winning or losing. Disease is a journey that calls for strength, sadness, believing, planning, hope, endurance, patience, joy, flexibility, mindfulness, resilience, and a sense of humor. Time and energy spent fighting the disease is not spent on loving each other and being together. This is a process, and at the end, he dies, not because he is a loser or weak, but because at the end of life comes death. When he dies, we'll say, he lived a full life. We'll say, he served his community as a physician. We'll say, he was loved and will be missed. We won't say he lost.
Mm,
Mm.
that's amazing. I appreciate you sharing that. That's so beautiful. Yeah, and that is, and I think about that, and I think about even the experience of the grief of losing my wife and the others in my life, and it's always with this clenched fist. I'm going to fucking beat this, right? Like I literally had thoughts of I will be the best griever to have ever lived, and I'm going to overcome this. And it wasn't until recently the most like random thing happened. I do trapeze, like the flying trapeze,
Yeah.
and I'm new to it still. I've only done it for a little while, but one of the movements, the foundational movement, is called the swing, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. There's steps in between that you have to do, and there's a lot of micro adjustments and movements, and everything comes off of that. So it's something that you constantly practice, and you're constantly adjusting. And I was up on the platform, and I was getting ready to take off, and the instructor said to me, "Is like, stop trying so hard. Just go with it." And in the moment, I was just like, holy shit, I'm literally like muscling my way through this without grace, and it's slowing me down and it's making it harder. And I came home that night and I was like, that's what I'm doing with my grief. I am muscling my way through this, and I am fighting through this. And in that moment of that guy telling me of like, let's not use win lose, let's not use battle, let's not use this thing, and I just realized that like it puts me in that mindset of like fighting.
You bring up a great point that honestly I hadn't thought about, but we take that whole binary win lose and we do take it over to grief, and we act
Mhm.
like, oh, this is something you can overcome.
Yeah.
Grief
Yeah.
inexperienced people will say, are you through the 5 stages yet? Well, first
Exactly.
of all, they're not. First of all,
Okay.
they were never meant to apply to
That's
grief.
right.
They were
That's
meant to
Yeah.
right.
apply to dying. And
Let's throw those
secondly,
out.
they're not. They're very valuable, but they just don't apply to grief, and they're not linear stages. I wish she had used the word elements or something. But anyway,
Mm.
yeah, you bring up an excellent point, and I think that's a little bit. That's probably, I don't know that I fought so hard. Like my grief was so different 41 years ago when David died. I think what I did was I just kept going,
Yeah.
and time time doesn't heal per se, but it does. You have, as more time has gone by, right? One day you go, an hour just went by and I was
Mhm.
okay, right?
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
were like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that can happen. And then it's 2
Mhm.
hours, and then it just, and you start, the load that you're carrying, the grief that you're carrying gets a little lighter, or as some people say, your life builds around it, and so it gets proportionately a little smaller than it was initially, and so it's more carryable, but it's not something to be fought or conquered.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the whole point of grief is it doesn't leave us. There is no way to get over it. And no matter how much I knew that and preached that and talked about it and told myself that, there was this light bulb moment of I am trying too hard, and it's compounding the effects of it, and I think it is the idea of time for me. I kind of like combine it with what you were saying, right? Like an hour goes by and then it's two. And then it's that idea that it's like we have to be mindful of every new beginning. And in the beginning, in the early stages of that grief, it was a second. Every second was a new beginning. Okay. I made it a second. I'm going another second. I just made it another second or a moment, a better word. And then, like you say, eventually that expands out. And to me, like, time is not what heals me. Time is what gives space to
Mhm.
breathe, to begin to heal.
Yeah, for sure. There's another there's another page in the journal, that's from after Bob died, and I talk about how, uh that I had read something about people talk about one day at a time, right?
Mhm.
Take it one day at a time. You know what? Some days, an entire fucking day is too much. Like, you are having trouble
Yeah.
considering the next minute, much less a day. And so whatever I read suggested and then obviously journaled about was, instead, at the end of the day, look back and say,
Mm.
I got through another day, right?
Yeah.
I got through another day. And
Yeah, I like that.
that's so much more powerful, I think, and effective when you're going through grief, that you're, instead of waking up in the morning and going, holy crap, how am I going to get through this day? That at night you're going, you know what, Jen, you did it. You did another one.
Mm.
Congratulations.
Man, that's so
Yeah.
powerful. I just started doing this thing. So I get homework every week from therapy, and my therapist is like, "What I need you to do now is," and it's kind of similar to this, is when you do something, you need to tell yourself, "Hey, that's awesome you just did that," and say it out loud. Tell yourself and congratulate yourself and thank yourself and be grateful to yourself. Even if you think you look crazy, just say it out loud.
Yeah, I started doing that with a journal, a couple years ago, just at the end of the day, writing down a couple of things that I had done that I was proud of myself
Oh,
for.
that's freaking awesome.
Yeah,
I
it
love
helps a
that.
lot. It helps a lot because we're so quick, all of us, to
Mhm.
beat ourselves up.
Oh, yeah.
That comes so quickly and so easily.
Uh-huh.
But congratulating ourselves, that is tougher, and yet it's perhaps more important.
I have another question for you, and it might feel a little random, but there's just something about the experience you had of journaling, the experience you had of everything that um it sounds like Bob had shown you and taught you and how he handles other families. So for my most of my life since I could remember, I have struggled with mental health, depression, anxiety, ruminations, and having grief put on top of that, and then having this health anxiety come about after everything that happened with my wife and then my son. He also ended up having a tumor 6 months after my wife died. There's this idea that is super popular now, and we're kind of touching on it: gratitude. Have a gratitude practice, it changes your life. You hear these things, and I will naturally want to go against the grain. So I'll be like, fuck your gratitude. Like, you're overblowing this as a panacea. And I got angry about it and just seeing what I call toxic positivity. And I think in that, I lost the idea that gratitude does have its place. So I want to ask you, in your experience, how can we have a gratitude practice, however small or big that looks like, while still acknowledging that sometimes for periods in life, it's impossible to truly feel grateful?
You know what, CJ? I think you bring up another excellent point. I am right there with you. I get very tired of the gratitude journal stuff and the just find what the silver lining. And I'm like, I had another a guy, a widower say to me, he was just like, I mean, what really matters is what you learn from it. And I'm like,
Mm,
that's not what really matters to me. Okay. What really
right,
matters to
right,
me is that I missed my damn husband. Like
right, right.
it just, everything is not just a teachable moment. Anyway, I'm with you 100%. It's funny that you bring up the gratitude. What I've been thinking a lot about lately, someday I'm going to write something about this, but it's not there yet, is what I call comparative suffering.
Mm,
So, as an 18-year-old who lost the most important person in my life, right? For many years, I did this whole thing in my head, and I still do it. I probably did it earlier today. I'm trying to think about what, but I think I did do it earlier today, where when I'm going through something tough, I say to myself, or I used to do this a lot, where I'd be like, well, if I got through David's death, like I can handle this, right?
yeah.
And I I think that quickly goes over into uh perhaps, I guess, what mixing two terms here might be considered a toxic gratitude, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
because I think what happens with comparative suffering and with what I'll call toxic gratitude is it's very quick to a sentence that begins with at least.
ah,
And that is always risky. It's okay to do it internally if it helps you, right? Get through the moment. Well, at least, right? When we were trying to do the technology stuff, and I was like,
yeah,
all of us have been through something, right? Way
yeah,
tougher
that's
than
right,
this. Like,
that's
let's
right.
just call it what it is.
Yeah,
But so easily, and this is where I think, this abundance of emphasis on so-called gratitude becomes a problem, is that turns into an external at least, right? And when you start saying at least to someone else,
yeah,
you're in the wrong. Like
that's
that, there's
right.
just, right? Because
Yeah.
now it's okay. It's like right? It's like talking about when your spouse talks about your family, right? I can
Yeah,
talk about my family. You can't talk about my family, right? But
yeah,
so
that's right.
I can give myself an at least, but you don't give me an at least, right? Because that's right.
Yep.
Somebody else does that, or I do that, God forbid, to somebody else. And I certainly have made that mistake in my
Yeah, me
life
too.
before. That's just ends up belittling their feelings, and because and those and that we need to do a lot less of that. So, and I think our whole world with social media and so forth has become just a cesspool of
Yes.
comparative suffering, of external comparative suffering. And it's not healthy, and it's not making for good relationships and connections and good feelings about ourselves and others.
Yeah, what an amazing point. I am now adding at least to that mental checklist that I have. Should is on there. At
Yeah,
least is gonna be on there
yeah.
to help me,
Should
like,
should is
yes,
Yeah.
bullshit. That's
it
what
is
I say.
awful. It
It
is.
is
It's like
bullshit.
all it
Yeah.
does is give and imply guilt. That's it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we say it
Don't
to
Yeah.
don't
ourselves and we say
right.
it to others.
Don't shit
Amazing.
on me. I don't I
Yes.
don't try not to shit on myself.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
That's so
Yep.
good. But I love this idea because I agree. One thing I have really kind of seen and experienced, especially with social media is that comparative. And then now having to be in the dating world, for some reason, magically, the algorithm starts showing me relationship advice. And I'm like, this
Mm.
is so generic with no nuance into what human relationships really look like. And it starts making you feel like every little thing is toxic and it's
Yeah.
always the other person's fault. And, this comparative of grief of like, well, I've had more grief than you, or this is what I've gone through. So pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get over it. Right.
Right,
Like
right.
we're even if we're not saying those words, we're conveying these things
That
and
we
just
are
piling on.
just wrong. Right.
And it could be used for things that are so beautiful. Like
Yeah.
we can be honest. We can go on to social media and be open and honest and build community. Like
Right.
I've seen that side too, and it's
Yeah.
beautiful. But
Yeah.
yes, anyways, that was a tangent, but I love the at least. I didn't know where you're going with that, and that strikes a chord with me so much. And I almost now need to go think about this because I remember I have vivid memories of conversations, those small little conversations with the kids in passing. Well, my wife and your mom died, whatever. We can handle this, right? Like those are conversations that I
Yeah.
am sure that I have had and
Right.
said to
And
my
I'm not
kids.
saying that they're not terrible, but recognizing that you're doing it, right,
Correct.
is what I for a long time I did not recognize that I was falling back on that a lot and that only takes you so far. It really does.
Right. And I'm curious what my intention was at the time, right? And I think that's really what it comes down to. What is the intention behind it? So, but anyways, I I don't want to keep you. I know we are getting close to time here. So the thing we love to do at the end, and if you're open to it, is we would love to hear a story, one of your favorite stories about Bob or David or both or your mom, really any story that you want to share about one of or all of your loved ones. We would love to hear a little bit about them.
Since we just talked about social media, I will share with you that as as difficult and as I think it's important to manage social media and our relationships with it, I will be forever grateful for social media because my brother died in 1983. And so there was a good 25 years, right, that I went on with my life and I would meet people and occasionally they would say, "Well, how many brothers and sisters do you have?" And I'd be able to say, "I had one and he died when I was 18 and he was 13."
Yeah.
But nobody except my family knew him. And I will be forever grateful for silly old Facebook because Facebook reconnected me with all the kids that David and I went to school with.
Mm.
The last school, high school that I graduated from went down to 5th grade. And so for the first time ever, David and I were in the same school. And he actually had his accident on his way to school in front of the school.
Oh, wow.
And my mother worked at the school.
Oh, no.
Yeah, yeah. So she came up on the accident on her way to school. And I have been able to reconnect with all of these people
Mhm.
who knew him and who have remembered him and sometimes have thought about him. Like when they find me on I had someone find me the other day. Messaged me and said, "I'm sure you don't remember me, but I was there on the day of the accident, and I was with him while the adults went to get help, And I haven't talked to her yet, but I'm eager to talk to her and have a real time communication. So, yeah, and by the same token, that doesn't limited to David. It's just that I lost 25 years of being with people who knew him as a friend. But it's the same with Bob. I'll post something, especially doing the work with the books and so forth. I'll post something and there will just be all these people who say, "Oh, he was this," or I remember this about him. It's also, I now split my time between Little Rock, Arkansas and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe is where I grew up. Little Rock is I never thought I would end up in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay, let's just be crystal clear about this. But I'm here and I'm pretty much staying because people will walk up to me here and say, "May I tell you a story about your husband?" And I am
Oh,
not giving
that's
that up,
amazing.
I am just not giving that
Yeah.
up. So, yeah, yeah,
I love I I totally feel that. It's, like, slightly different for me, but because my mom died when I was 9, so obviously we didn't have social media then, but now getting to share, like, when I share photos of her, her friends are always there to comment, like, my family tells stories and stuff like that, but I think they just give you a different perspective, or they tell you kind of just something you didn't really know, or even when I'm posting completely, like, things that aren't even about her, they'll be like, "Oh, your mom used to love to do that," or things like that that, you just
yeah.
you wouldn't get otherwise.
Right. Sometimes I'll post a picture of myself, and people who knew my parents will be like, "You are a cross between your mother and father." You like you are exactly like, you know what I mean? They'll just be, and it's such a great feeling, and it's just that connection that you're so afraid is going to get lost because so many people think that because someone has died, that somehow everything ends. And I have this, the Hospice Doctor's Widow came out as a second edition recently, and I added some journal entries at the end that were all grief based. And the last page is love is greater than death.
Mm,
I don't know if you can
Oh,
see that,
love
but
that.
yeah. Yeah, and it is,
Oh,
right?
I love
Love is
that.
greater than death. Yeah.
yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it's our ability to hold that grief and that death is what creates more love and abundance in our life. And
Exactly.
I'm so glad that you guys shared that because I do think that we it can get lost that there's so much beautiful things that come out of this online connection that we have. It's really about what we choose to put into it and where we choose to put our attention. If we focus it in on the things that bring joy and beauty and power into our life because they do exist on the platforms, it's just
Right.
what are we going to allow in and how are we going to use it as a tool?
Right.
And those are great examples. And we did that when Ariana was in hospice, organizing and getting people to reach out to us and being able to communicate. That's how this podcast started. Ashley was like, "Hey, I see you writing a bunch of stuff because I've written about my mental health journey, which naturally meant I was writing about Ariana and our grief journey." And she's like, "Let's start a podcast." It was more than that, but it was basically that. Like, it's so beautiful, and it can be. It doesn't. We don't have to throw everything out because there's downfalls to it.
Right. And it's not, the other thing is, it's not dark. People, when I get, unfortunately or unfortunately, I don't know what, it's just how it is that when someone gets a bad diagnosis, I get a phone call and people, which I am honored, right? I'll get a call. Here's what's happening. What do you think? What should we do? This and that. And I had a few years ago, before her own mother died, my cousin, we were talking about, death and loss and so forth. And I don't remember what we were saying, but she said, it's kind of dark. And I said, I just don't see it that way. It's not dark, right? Just because the person you love or the people you loved have
That's right.
died does not make it dark. It's still love.
Yeah.
Yes.
The constant is love.
That's beautiful. We're going to end on that note because that is so true. It is love. Just because it is, we hide grief, we put it in the shadows, And because it's hard doesn't mean it's scary or that it's dark. It is love. That is beautiful. I love it. We appreciate so much for being on the show. I know we had a little bit of issues with the technology in the beginning, but we powered through. We got
We
here.
did.
We got to the end. And thank you for coming on. And also, where can we find this journal?
You can get it. You can order it through your bookstore, or you can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It is called The Hospice Doctor's Widow, an art journal of caregiving and grief.
Amazing.
And it is definitely a second edition, which Amazon has not figured out how to put the photo of the cover up yet. But they still have the first edition up. Yeah, because that's how it is. But anyway, so don't buy the first edition, please. Buy the second edition if you're interested in the journal, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Day After. You can find this podcast and more at our website at www.thedayafter.com. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts.